I want to thank you all again for your time and attention, for all those people who are watching online. We appreciate you contributing. If you do have any questions for us or for any of the speakers, please feel free to share them. Do it through the chat, which is on the tab, and we'll make sure to relay those questions that you have to the speaker as you present them. I have the privilege of presenting our next speaker, who is Marichel Mejia, who's working with Student Action with Workers. And their work was pretty, to be honest, I'm from an urban center, I'm Puerto Rican. A lot of the issues she's going to talk about, I'm not very familiar with, and I had to educate myself before I would, approach a person of this caliber and with this information, because I knew it was critical to the core to caring for our communities. And that's the main reason we invited her today to speak to us, because there are many Latinos who are suffering and struggling in terms of getting access and equity, who reside on farms in rural communities. And that's the main reason we brought her here, to help educate us and enlighten us on the issues that they're facing. So please, without further ado, please help bring her on with a round of applause and show her some LMSA love.
How's everybody? Wow. Hello. How's everybody doing this morning? Thank you, Raymond. Ray, I suppose, for that introduction. I guess well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you to the Latino Medical Student Association for inviting me here to speak today. I'll give a little intro about myself before I continue with the presentation. As Ray mentioned, my name is Marichel Mejia. I come from Minnesota, graduated from Macalester College, and pues vengo de padre panameño y madre gringa. So a little mix of cultures here. And what I'm going to be talking about today in my presentation are farm workers. And as you can see, the title is Food for Thought, Medical Access and Occupational Health Risks Among America's Farm Worker Population. So, today in my presentation, just to give you guys an outline of what I'll cover. First, a general introduction to farm workers. If some of you are not familiar with who farm workers are and what they do, I'll be able to provide that information. Occupational health issues that are associated with farm work, barriers to health access that a lot of farm workers encounter, policy recommendations for both the federal and the state level, and also actions that we as individuals can take starting today once we leave the room. And also, before I begin, I'd just like to mention that Ray was passing around little strips of paper. On each of these strips of paper is a quote from a farm worker. And those of you who have the pink slips of paper, if you would so kindly read your quote when it appears on the slide of my presentation, that would be great. I thought it was very important. Unfortunately, since I could not have any farm workers with me here today to speak for themselves, I thought it was very important that their voice is still heard and that they are present here with all of us. So, we're going to start with just this simple, quick question. Where does my food come from? We all like to enjoy oranges, apples, grapes, lettuce, peppers. Just exactly how does it get from the tree or in the ground or on the vine to the grocery store or on our dinner plates at night? Where does it come from? How does it all transpire? Well, how it happens is there's a very key labor force involved in this process. And this labor force is farm workers. But who are farm workers? Essentially, farm workers are the very hardworking men and women and even children who migrate throughout the country or work seasonally, cultivating, irrigating, and harvesting the fruits and vegetables that we all like to consume. They're not farmers out in Iowa with a 40-acre plot, but rather hired hands that work in the U.S.'s large-scale agricultural industry, or in many ways, open-air factorized fields. And I'll talk about the occupational and health risks associated with this later on. To get an idea of the scale of the number of farm workers, there are about 85% of all fruits and vegetables produced in the U.S. are hand-picked by farm workers. And that's a lot. And it is estimated that there are over 3 million farm workers working here in this country. For some demographics on farm workers, just a little introduction, 78% are foreign-born, with slightly over 75% being from Mexico. So the majority are of Mexican origin, but there's also considerable Haitian and also increasing Central American populations. It's a relatively young workforce. The average age is about 33 years old, and according to a 2005 survey, 53% of farm workers are undocumented. I've also seen other studies, or several other studies, that say it's higher than that, upwards of 75%, but it's safe to say that slightly over the majority are undocumented. And 13% of farm workers have completed less than 3 years of schooling, and the average education level is about 6th grade, or at least in the form of traditional schooling that has taken place. Farm workers also do not make that much money. The average annual income for a farm worker is $11,000 a year. For farm worker families, it's about $16,000 a year. This makes farm work the second lowest paid job in the nation. So these were some general, now you have a general introduction and overview about farm workers. There's also 3 different kinds, generally speaking. There are H-2A, which are guest workers brought to work in the United States from Mexico for a period of time, usually around 6 months, at least here in North Carolina. There are migrants, which are basically workers who migrate throughout the United States following a particular crop. I know here in the Southeast, you generally get people who work in the orange groves in Florida, migrate up to North Carolina to work in either sweet potato or tobacco, and then migrate up towards like New York or possibly Michigan, I think, to work in like cherry or blueberries or other types of crops. And then you have seasonal workers, which are workers who have a permanent residence, who live in the same place throughout the year, but work seasonally on different crops, or just during one particular season. So as an introduction to farm workers, I'm going to now continue with some of the health risks that take place in relation to their occupation. And this includes pesticides, heat stress, green tobacco sickness and stoop labor, and then also working with dangerous farming equipment. So all of these factors that kind of relate to like farm labor also present health risks for them as well. Somebody has a pesticide quote, if they would like to read it, please. Or it's on a pink, the quote you have should match the quote that is up there. But likewise, there are other quotes throughout this room that do relate to pesticides.
I have it.
Okay.
Quote, many times, we come early to work when they have just finished spraying and the leaves are wet with chemicals. I feel a lot of inflammation on my hands from the chemicals that they put on the grape plants. In addition, nobody knows what the long-term effects of pesticides are. Your body is eventually going to respond to being exposed to the chemicals. End quote. Javier Flores.
Yes, thank you very much for reading that quote. So as we can see from Javier Flores, who is a grape picker from California, farm workers have a lot of exposure to pesticides. And this is either, sprayed by hands when they're spraying the plants, or through self-propelled machinery, or through aerial applications sprayed by a plane. And because of this, farm workers are exposed to pesticides either through breathing it in the air, getting it sprayed on them or spilled on them, or touching plants that have residue, or receiving pesticide drift either from the field that they're working in or an adjacent field. And because of this, farm workers suffer from the highest rate of toxic chemical injuries and skin disorders of any workers in the United States. And this causes acute and both long-term symptoms that are associated with pesticide exposure. Short-term would be nausea, vomiting, dizziness, headaches, and rashes and burns. Long-term, as we all know, would be cancer, sterility, and birth defects. And it's very interesting to note the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, enforced worker protection standards in 1992 which required that employers provide pesticide protection training to their workforce, to the farm workers. However, many studies, such as a 2005 study in Texas, found that only 56% of farm workers reported had been ever received training or instruction in safe pesticide use. I know from my own experience working at a rural community health clinic doing outreach with migrant farm worker populations, one of the key components to our program is pesticide education, because oftentimes the farm workers have not received training on how to protect themselves when dealing with these dangerous chemicals. Furthermore, another study has shown that there has been issues with field sanitation and hygiene standards being met in the field, such as access to water and soap, so that if somebody gets sprayed with pesticides, they'll be able to wash it off themselves, at least through the skin, and also having a place to wash their clothes back when they return to the camps, should pesticides get on the clothing. And these are very simple things, and yet, in 1990, OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health, I'm not sure if it's administration or authority, found that 69% of field workplaces were in violation of these regulations that were in place. So, as you can see, farm workers have a lot of exposure to pesticides, but the proper training to protect themselves, as well as the proper safety equipment in terms of water and hygiene sanitation standards are not being met at the workplace. Heat stress. Someone should have a heat stress
Quote, "The work itself is not too easy or difficult. The only thing is that I suffer because of the heat. If you have an allergy or are weak, you will not be able to adjust to this job. With just a little bit of heat, someone can get dizzy or pass out. But we have to do it because there is no other option." End quote. Carlos Ramirez.
Thank you very much. So, as I suppose Carlos explained, farm workers, one of the difficulties they have to encounter health-wise is heat stress. Farm workers work very long, labor-intensive days, often waking up at, beginning work at 6 in the morning and not finishing till 6 at night. I know now some of the tobacco workers that I've been working with aren't leaving work until 8 or 10 o'clock at night. So this can be 10, upwards to 12-hour days, very long, working in very high temperatures. A lot of the areas where farm workers, for example, the Central Valley of California, which can get very hot, places like Florida where there's high temperatures and humidity, even here in North Carolina. I come from Minnesota, I tell you I've been suffering because it's very hot here. But imagine farm workers who have to work these long hours in these conditions and with a lot of direct sun exposure, because out in the field there's no trees for shade. From 1992 to 2006, 423 workers in agriculture and industries died because of heat exposure. Crop workers have an average annual heat-related death rate of 0.39 per every 100,000 workers, compared to 0.02 for all U.S. civilian workers. Besides the fact that farm workers have a lot of exposure to very high temperatures and very strong sunlight and humidity, they often have little access to shade or water, which are very critical for their health and to prevent heat stress. In 2005, the National Agricultural Workers Survey found that 20% of farm workers reported having no access to drinking water and cups. Even now, both when I was doing organizing work at the UFW in California and also here as working at a health clinic in North Carolina, even if there is water, you hear from a lot of the workers that it's either at a very long distance from where they're actually working, or the water just simply is not potable water. It's not good tasting water. So it's another issue. I know in California they have laws in place that require that employers provide shade for their workers, but oftentimes you go out to the fields, and it's very rarely that you find shade. I don't believe in North Carolina there even is a law requiring that employers provide shade for their workers. Furthermore, another work-related issue is that farm workers face a lot of pressure from their foremen and supervisors to meet high production quotas and are very encouraged to keep working fast. And if they need to go get a drink of water or if they need to take a 10-minute rest break, they're actively discouraged from doing so. And this is very dangerous for their health and contributes towards heat stress in farm workers because, as we all know, if one cannot take 10 minutes to recuperate your body or be able to take water when you're working in very high temperatures doing labor-intensive work, you could get heat stress or worse. So that's another issue associated with farm workers. So it has a quote on green.
Quote, "Tobacco is very difficult. It's too much for one's health. Sometimes I lose my appetite or feel like throwing up," end quote. Miguel Angel.
So as Miguel told us, farm workers can often, especially tobacco workers, which is pretty much dominant crop here in North Carolina, face a unique health risk due to the fact that they work with tobacco and consequently nicotine exposure. Farm workers, a study found that farm workers who work in the tobacco fields have the nicotine exposure that is equivalent to 36 cigarettes per day. And what happens is the tobacco leaves have nicotine in them, and either if there's dew on them or if it has just rained, the nicotine can get contact onto the skin and stain the skin and be absorbed into the bloodstream through the pores. So very often farm workers have a lot of exposure to the nicotine through just their job. Also, another type of work-related health issues, is musculoskeletal injuries, and this is because farm labor consists of a lot of bending, twisting, or carrying heavy items, and repetitive motions during long hours of work. And so musculoskeletal injuries can arise from this. The most predominant ones would be pain in the back, shoulders, and the hands. And from 1999 to 2004, almost 20% of farm workers reported musculoskeletal injuries, and sprains, strains, and back pains accounted for 30% of missed work, with back pain coming in at 25%. Once again, I know we mentioned before with heat stress that farm workers are often pressured to meet high production quotas. A lot of farm workers, if they're not paid by the hour, they're paid by piece rate, which means according to the quantity of tomatoes they pick, or however many fruits or vegetables they harvest, they get paid per pound or per the amount of how much they pick, as an incentive for them to work faster. And this, working at a high speed also discourages workers from taking a break, even 10 minutes, that would allow their body some time to recuperate. Because of this, musculoskeletal injuries can happen. I know, from my experience, when I was out in California, we would go do house visits with the workers. A lot of the older workers you would see who worked for a grape picking company used to require that they work on their knees when they were picking the grapes. A lot of the workers, the older ones I spoke to, have canes or, can't walk very well because of these injuries that arise from so many years of doing this type of stoop labor and rough work. Next quote.
Working with heavy machinery is always a risk for serious, if not life-threatening, injury. I guess that's why we're lucky to have the outreach clinics to warn us about being safe around farm working equipment. David Navarro.
See, so as David stated, farm workers often have to work around dangerous equipment. Agricultural labor is one of the top 3 most dangerous occupations in the United States. And it's because they often have to carry large loads, climb ladders, or work on or around heavy machinery. And the disability rate for farm workers is up to 3 times the rate for the rest of the general U.S. population. Furthermore, a 2006 study found that the agricultural industry has the second highest rate of occupational injuries and illness resulting in lost days of work in any other industry. Only construction was higher. And a study from 1992 to 2001 found that the leading cause of fatal occupational injuries were from farm tractors, which account for 2,165 farm worker deaths. Other deaths that are related to this type of occupational work came trucks at 795 deaths, harvesting machines at 253 deaths, mowing machines 228, and just general agricultural machines 168 deaths. So it's a very dangerous occupation I guess in terms of heat and pesticide exposure, but also through in terms of the equipment as well. It's also important to note that for agricultural workers in the U.S., there's 25.7 occupational deaths for agriculture, which compares to a rate of just 3.7 deaths for every 100,000 workers in all other industries. So it's a very labor-intensive and risky job, which has health risks associated with it. But ironically, there is a lack of access for the farm worker community despite all these prominent health risks that they face because of their occupation. 85% of migrant and seasonal farm workers are uninsured compared to just 37% of low-income people nationally. 9 in 10 children of migrant and seasonal farm worker families are uninsured compared to less than a quarter of low-income children nationally. And a 2000 study found that only 20% of migrant and seasonal farm workers reported using any health care services, and only 42% of women in farm workers' families reported seeking early prenatal care compared to over 3/4 of women nationally. So it's a very, very shocking statistics. But it's not just the fact that there are services out there and farm workers, aren't using. The issue is that they're not accessible to the farm worker community. And there's kind of 2 general reasons for this. One would be that simply because employers in the agricultural industry do not provide healthcare services to farm workers. Only 8% of farm workers report being covered by employer-provided health insurance. I also would like to mention, in the organizing work I did in California, the only way, most of the farm workers I spoke to, the only way that they had health insurance was if they had unionized, and if the union, in the union contract, it specified that their employer would provide some form of health coverage for the farm workers. Other than that, pretty much non-existent. And even here in North Carolina, the work I'm doing with my community health clinic, none of the farm workers that I've met so far have health insurance. The other issue sometimes relates to limited Medicaid assistance. Since 1996, I believe, recent immigrants, including legal immigrants, were excluded from Medicaid for the first 5 years. Also, in terms of financial eligibility, some states have monthly budgeting rules and also restrictive asset tests, which makes it difficult for farm workers to access Medicaid because they often have fluctuating incomes as well as employment-related assets. Furthermore, farm workers who may be eligible for Medicaid can still face barriers such as difficulties in completing the application and enrollment process given limited English skills, as well as inaccessible site locations. Furthermore, Medicaid is a state-based program which recognizes residency among people who live in a state for work-related purposes. They're also required to provide out-of-state coverage to permit travel, but the coverage can often be very limited. and only cover perhaps emergency situations. And farm workers can have difficulties encountering, areas that out-of-state providers that will actually honor like a traveling Medicaid card. It's very difficult, especially for the migrant workers who travel from state to state. You could be in Florida, go to North Carolina, and then New York. Even there's a stream that I believe that goes from Texas to Michigan, and maybe, I know there's some from Texas who go to my home state of Minnesota as well. So those are some of the barriers that relate to that. However, there are also additional barriers that kind of relate to farm workers as, a specific community, and that is affordability, transportation, and language.
Quote, if we get sick, I try to cure them, the girls, with some remedies I've learned at home or some kind of medicine that I can get at the pharmacy that I understand a little bit about how it helps to cure. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. It was very, very hard for us to decide to take Cynthia to the doctor. I was afraid we have to pay much money, end quote. Esperanza Martinez.
So, as Esperanza said, going to the doctor, visiting the doctor can be very expensive sometimes. I know it's expensive for those of us who have insurance, and it's probably very, very expensive for those who do not. And the sheer high medical costs can be a deterrent from seeking medical care. And oftentimes farm workers can rely on their own home remedies or postpone visiting the doctor until the situation becomes so severe that they need to go to the doctor or visit the emergency room, which can also bring costly bills. Furthermore, transportation is another issue in terms of medical access for farm workers. Oftentimes, at least the migrant workers are isolated in rural areas at migrant camps and don't have, they certainly don't have their own car. The only transportation they have is the bus that takes them to and from work in the morning. So being able to get to a clinic that may be 45 minutes away certainly poses barriers, as well as limited clinic hours. As was stated before, farm workers may not get off of work until 7 p.m. at night, 6, or maybe even 9 p.m. at night. But if the clinic is only open until 5, then how can farm workers access it? That is a barrier as well. Also, another important issue is that farm workers oftentimes, just as their employers do not provide health insurance, farm workers are also not protected by sick leave, or they risk losing employment. It's always a very difficult decision for farm workers to go to the doctor, seek medical attention, because A, their wages are so low. If they were to take time off of work, that's time off that they could be making money to support their families. Also, unfortunately, there are a lot of people who need jobs, who do need to work, and are working in the fields because of that. If they tell their employer that they need to take a day off, it's not uncommon for their employer to be like, well, there's a whole line of other people who are here who would be willing to take this job. If you don't want to work, fine, don't work, I'll get somebody else. So, and they're not protected by sick leave as well. So these are kind of the power dynamics that do restrict farm workers from seeking medical attention outside from these other barriers that they face. Another issue, too, is interpretation services. 81% of farm workers in the service speak Spanish, and only 18% speak English. So it's very critical that the clinics at the places that they do go to do have bilingual services to be able to serve the communities that are around them. If they don't, that serves as a barrier as well. So now I'm going to talk about some policy recommendations that could take place at both the state and the federal level. One of them would be just improving access to Medicaid for farm workers, which would be through facilitating more fluid eligibility reciprocity across states, federal guidelines for implementing a fast-track enrollment option for farm workers, or changing the existing eligibility criteria and also identifying health centers and other sites that would serve as enrollment sites. There also could be the creation of a federal coverage program for farm workers and their families, and increased federal or state funding for rural community health clinics and programs so that they can do outreach, provide these transportation services for the farm worker communities. At the federal legislation level, I'm going to be very frank and honest about this. There do need to be more laws passed that protect the rights of agricultural workers. Farm workers are excluded from the National Labor Relations Act, which protects the rights to collectively bargain. And I think it would be very critical if the collective bargaining rights of farm workers was acknowledged or put in place in the form of a law, so that way farm workers can negotiate through a union contract for company-provided insurance, sick leave, that water and rest breaks are accessible to them without fear of retaliation from their boss, and that there are grievance procedures set up at the workplace. Also federally, they could do more like federal standards to improve the housing conditions that farm workers stay at. I know I didn't touch on this in the presentation, but the housing conditions of many migrant and many H-2A guest workers in the camps are not very good. And this definitely poses health risks for the farm workers as well. As I said, for example, a washing machine. To be able to wash off pesticides or even nicotine residue that may be on the clothing is important to have. It's a law that there's a washing machine for every 15 workers, but sometimes you go to camps, there's not even a washing machine, or they have to buy the washing machine themselves. Also, functioning bathrooms and showers, another critical importance. These are very basic things that farm workers oftentimes do not have access to, or they're very substandard. And finally, enforcement of state and federal agricultural laws that do already exist, which would be, some of the ones I mentioned, water and shade access, making sure that if there's a law that there should be a washing machine for every 15 workers, that there is a washing machine, and that the showers and bathrooms, everything are full functioning. And finally, what can you all do? What can we as individuals do today once we leave this room, take proactive steps towards serving the farm worker community and making a positive change? And there are things you can do through your medical profession, there are things you can do as an activist, and there are things you can do as a consumer. Through your medical profession, you could consider working at a rural health clinic, encouraging bilinguality at the workplace, providing transportation services to farm workers, or doing health education outreach to the camps. As an activist, you can volunteer into your community and possibly at a Latino organization that serves migrant farm worker populations. You can donate directly to a farm worker organization or farm worker advocacy organization, such as Student Action with Farm Workers, which is what I'm a member of. And you can also support farm worker unions, such as the UFW, United Farm Workers of America, FLOC, Farm Labor Organizing Committee, based out of here in the Southeast, CIW, Coalition of Immokalee Workers, and PICUN, which is based out of the Pacific Northwest, and their campaigns. I also have here materials that you can grab, information about staff, general information about farm workers, and here, these are very handy-dandy. These are a list of union label produce that you can buy. So if you see these labels, then you know that their workers are being treated fairly, or at least they'll have sufficient rights. And on the back is Farm Worker Family, and then the inside's the list. Fits in your wallet, very handy. I also passed around the quotes, the way to join the SAF listserv, so that's another option. Oh, and then as a consumer, buy union label produce and shop locally from farmers markets and not partake in, I suppose, like a large agro industry that exploits human beings and does not help with their health very much. So thank you, everyone.
We do have questions you might have. Does anyone have any questions you would have for her?
You mentioned the coalition in Immokalee.
Mm-hmm.
Any updates going on right now? Any issues affecting that community right now?
Yes.
Could you repeat the question just so people who don't hear it online?
Oh, the question was regarding the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, and he wanted to know if there are any, I guess, current campaigns or any issues that they're focusing on right now. Yes, they are. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers is a Florida-based organization that was based out of Immokalee, Florida, mainly tomato pickers who were facing being exploited in many ways, facing modern-day slavery, and they organized themselves to fight for increased wages and also for rights, etc. Their main issue was penny per pound. So for each pound of tomatoes that they'd pick, they would receive a penny more that would directly go to the workers, and it would dramatically increase their wages. So they have penny per pound agreements with large fast food chains such as Taco Bell, KFC, Pizza Hut, and now their current campaign is with Quiznos. So you can go check out the CIW website online and look for ways that you can get involved with their campaign against Quiznos. They also have one with Trader Joe's. So those are some issues and actions that they're focusing on right now.
Sorry, I wanted to emphasize, I guess, the importance that you touched on occupational health, and maybe as an opportunity for an organization like LMSA to really expand on your point about the industry. Top 3 industries: construction, agriculture, and transportation. If you think about the demographics who work in these jobs, it's our gente. So, and nowhere in healthcare reform is there anything that's addressing occupational health. So it's just a continued overlooked issue. And I'm not saying we should tackle this now, but it's something to be on our radars that's really affecting our people. Thank you for all your work.
Oh no! Thank you all. It's a very big privilege to be here. I'm going to be completely honest and frank. I was nervous to come here because I knew I would be in the presence of such great leaders and people who more than anything want to give back to the community. And so I really appreciate being here and having had the opportunity to talk with you all. And yeah, occupational health is critical. You know, the job is the way that you make a living and should not be the way that you lose your life or put your life at risk. And so I think health is a very critical component of that.
Another question?
Many of us, as Ray noted, either are from large cities or our medical schools are in large cities, but surely outside those large cities are farm workers who are in need. Do any of the organizations you mentioned or the resources you have a geographic almost like directory where medical school chapters around the nation could perhaps locate an area near them that they could collaborate with and help with?
Yes. The coalition.
Repeat the question. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. What is your name again? Sorry. Victor. Okay. Victor was wondering, I guess, about some of the farm worker organizations that were mentioned here, kind of where regionally they were based so that possibly medical students could go and like team up with them to do health reach or partner with them. Yes. A lot of the ones that were listed here were unions or very large farm worker organizations. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers is based out of Florida, but they're also active here too in the Southeast. The UFW is primarily based out of California, Washington, Arizona, kind of like the western part. PCOON is based out of the Pacific Northwest. And then Flock is based out of Ohio, and also they're doing a lot of organizing work here in North Carolina. But I think there's a lot of farm worker organizations out there. They're probably small, but a little bit difficult to find, just like the camps. But they are out there. And I know for anybody who is here from North Carolina, there is the Farmworkers Project, North Carolina Farmworkers Project, based out of Benson, North Carolina. And we actually take medical students from Chapel Hill, and I think a couple of Duke students, to go and do health outreach. So, and there's also SAF, Student Action with Farmworkers, which is based right at the Center for Documentary Studies here at Duke. So regionally across the U.S., there's definitely farmworker organizations out there. There is even one from Minnesota that I didn't know about, Centro Campesino. So it takes a little bit of searching, but you can find. Oh, yes, sorry.
Let's go ahead and thank her once again for coming here and educating us on this issue.